She trembled, confessing, and in that moment, everything changed between them. What happened after that first time revealed a love neither of them expected to feel. Where are you watching this story from? Subscribe to the channel and leave a like so you don't miss the ending of this complete surrender. The evening light bathed the garden in golden and amber tones when Emmett Ashford crossed the wrought iron gate of his newest acquisition. The air smelled of magnolia and damp earth, an intoxicating combination that contrasted brutally with the sterile environment of the boardrooms where he'd spent the last 3 months negotiating the purchase of this estate in Charleston. His Italian leather shoes crunched on the gravel path as he admired the Confederate jasmine climbing the whitewashed brick walls. Then he saw her. Among the gardenias and climbing roses, a female figure knelt on the red clay soil, her shoulders shaking with sobs that broke the evening silence. Dark hair fell like a curtain over her face, and her hands, stained with earth, covered her eyes. Emmett stopped in his tracks, feeling something strange stir in his chest, something he hadn't experienced in years of building a real estate empire across the American South. "Miss?" His voice came out softer than he intended, almost tentative. She looked up abruptly, revealing hazel eyes bright with tears. For an instant, time seemed to suspend. Emmett, accustomed to controlling every situation, every negotiation, every encounter, found himself completely disarmed by that gaze full of vulnerability and pain. I'm so sorry, sir," she stammered, getting to her feet immediately and wiping her cheeks with the back of her hand, leaving trails of damp earth. "I didn't know you were coming today. I was saying goodbye." "Saying goodbye?" Emmett frowned, taking a step toward her. "I'm Maeve Calloway, sir. I worked here." Her voice broke slightly. "Caring for the garden. Mrs. Pemberton left for Europe without notice, no warning. I found out just an hour ago. I need this job. My grandmother in the Appalachian Mountains depends on me." The words tumbled out, loaded with contained desperation. Emmett observed her trembling hands, the simple but impeccably clean cotton dress, the worn but well-maintained work boots. There was something about her, in her dignity despite the tears, that moved him in a way he didn't understand. "You're not losing your job," he heard himself say, surprising himself. "In fact, I want you to continue. Triple the salary you were receiving before." Maeve looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and hope so pure that Emmett felt as if he'd just made the best investment of his life. And in that moment, under the South Carolina sky turning violet, surrounded by the perfume of flowers and the distant song of cicadas, the 42-year-old magnate began to discover that some treasures have no price. Because sometimes destiny doesn't arrive at the expected moment, but at the precise instant when two opposite worlds need to collide to create something completely new. The following weeks unfolded in a delicate dance of seemingly casual encounters. Emmett discovered he had urgent matters to attend to at the Charleston estate, with a frequency that would have made his executive assistant in Manhattan raise an eyebrow with suspicion. Each visit inevitably led him to the garden, where Maeve worked with a dedication that bordered on devotional. He watched her from a distance initially, fascinated by the way she talked to the plants, whispering words of encouragement while pruning the azaleas or watering the hydrangeas. Her movements were fluid, graceful, as if she were part of the landscape itself. The coastal breeze played with her loose hair, and she laughed when monarch butterflies landed on her shoulders. "Plants are like people, you know," she said one day when he finally dared to approach, pretending to inspect a particularly lush camellia. "They need attention, patience, and above all, they need to feel loved to flourish." Emmett, who had spent 2 decades treating people like pieces on a chessboard, felt strangely ashamed by those words. When was the last time he had treated anything with true love instead of mere efficiency? "And you?" he heard himself ask. "Have you flourished?" Maeve looked up, surprised by the question. For a moment her face showed a sadness so deep that he regretted asking. I don't know," she finally responded, with disarming honesty. "Sometimes I feel like I stayed trapped in the cocoon, Mr. Ashford. That life passed while I cared for other people's dreams." "Emmett?" he corrected her gently. "Call me Emmett." It was the beginning of a friendship neither had anticipated. Emmett began to extend his visits, bringing coffee from the best roaster in Savannah, fresh croissants from a century-old bakery in the historic district. They sat on the wrought iron bench under the wisteria-covered pergola, and they talked. Maeve told him about her childhood in a small mountain community in Appalachia, about how she'd been raised by her grandmother after her parents died in a car accident when she was only 6. She spoke of mornings helping in the vegetable garden, afternoons learning to identify medicinal plants in the woods, evenings listening to stories of a world beyond the mountain horizon. "Grandma always said I had restlessness in my soul," she confessed with a melancholic smile, "that I needed to fly farther than the hawks. But she also taught me that dignity is the only thing no one can take from you, that a person's true worth isn't measured in possessions, but in how they treat others." Emmett listened, absorbed, discovering a universe his accelerated lifestyle had never allowed him to contemplate. He was surprised to discover that Maeve, at 25, had never left the South, never flown on a plane, never seen an opera or visited a major museum. "But you've seen things I'll never see," he told her one afternoon, with a conviction that caught her by surprise. "You've seen sunrise from an empty beach. You've known the satisfaction of creating life with your own hands. You've maintained real relationships with people who want nothing from you except your company." The revelation hit him forcefully. He, with all his money and power, lived in a crystal prison where every interaction was tinged with interest, where every smile hid an agenda. "Why are you telling me all this?" Maeve asked, genuinely curious. "We're from completely different worlds." Emmett looked into her eyes and, for the first time in years, was completely honest. "Because with you, I feel real. Like I can take off the mask I've worn so long I forgot my own face." The silence that followed was charged with meaning. In the distance, the church bells in the town marked 6 in the evening, and the first fireflies began their luminous dance among the rosemary bushes. Because true human connection knows no social hierarchies, only souls that recognize in the other what they lack in themselves. The proposal came during a June evening when the heat began to yield and the garden exhaled the accumulated aromas of the day. Emmett had arrived straight from the airport, still in his suit wrinkled from the flight from London, but unable to wait another day to see her. "I want you to come with me to New York," he said without preamble, with that determination he used in boardrooms. "There's an exotic plant auction at the Botanical Garden. I thought you'd be interested." Maeve dropped the pruning shears she was holding. The metallic sound against the stone path resonated louder than it should have. "New York," she repeated, as if the word were in an unknown language. I can't, Mr. Ashford." "Emmett, I can't just go to New York." "Why not?" He frowned, genuinely confused. "It would only be a day, 2 at most." "I'd pay for your time, of course, and—" "It's not about money," she interrupted him, and there was something in her voice he hadn't heard before, a mixture of frustration and fear. "It's just, I don't do that kind of thing. I don't travel with men to other cities. What would people think? What would I tell my grandmother?" Emmett felt as if he'd been slapped. In his world of spontaneous flights to Paris for dinner and weekends in the Maldives, he had completely forgotten that other codes, other concerns existed. "Maeve, I didn't mean to," he began, but she had already moved away, walking quickly toward the shed where she kept her tools. He followed her, something he never did. Emmett Ashford didn't chase anyone. It was others who sought him. But with her, all his rules seemed to disintegrate. "Wait, please." He caught up with her right at the shed door, where the smell of damp earth and organic fertilizer was almost overwhelming. "I'm sorry. I didn't think. I just wanted to share something beautiful with you. I thought it would make you happy." Maeve turned, and he saw her eyes gleaming, though not with tears, but with a more complex emotion. "And didn't it occur to you that maybe we live in different realities?" Her voice trembled slightly. "You can get on a plane without thinking twice. I have to ask my neighbor to collect my mail if I leave for a day. You wear suits that cost more than my 3-month salary. I feel self-conscious in this old dress every time I see you arrive." The words fell between them like stones in a pond, creating ever-widening ripples. Emmett realized with painful clarity how many chasms separated them beyond the obvious economic one. There was a cultural, educational, experiential gulf, and he, in his arrogance, had assumed money could build a bridge over all of them. "You're right," he admitted, lowering his guard completely. "I've been an idiot. A privileged idiot who thinks the world operates according to his own rules. But Maeve—" He took a step toward her, hands open in a gesture of vulnerability. "I don't want this garden to be all we share. I want to show you the world, yes, but more than that. I want to know yours. I want to understand where you come from, what makes you laugh, what keeps you awake at night." The evening wind moved Maeve's loose hair, and for a moment she looked at him with an intensity that made him feel completely exposed. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why me? There are thousands of women in your world who would be more appropriate, more—" "Because they don't make me want to be better," he interrupted her with brutal honesty. "Because when I'm with you, I don't think about the next deal, the next acquisition, the next goal. I think about how the afternoon light makes your eyes look like amber. I think about how you talk to plants as if they were your children. I think that I've never met anyone so genuinely good." The silence that followed seemed eternal. Finally, Maeve sighed, and there was surrender in that sound. "One day," she said softly. "I'll go with you to New York for one day. But with conditions. Separate rooms, clear schedules, and you introduce me as your gardening consultant, nothing more." Emmett smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his normally serious face. "Gardening consultant," he accepted. "Perfect." As he walked back to his car that night, under a starry sky he rarely took time to observe, Emmett understood he had just crossed a threshold. He was no longer simply a man fascinated by a beautiful woman. He was beginning to fall in love, and that terrified him as much as it excited him. Because true love is not a conquest, it's a surrender. It's not possessing, but learning to receive. New York received them with humid, oppressive heat in mid-July. Emmett had kept his promise. 2 adjoining but separate rooms at the plaza overlooking Central Park, and an itinerary that included the auction at the Botanical Garden, but also time for Maeve to explore the city at her own pace. Her transformation began on the plane. Maeve, who had never traveled faster than 60 miles per hour in her life, was literally glued to the window, watching with amazed eyes as the southern landscape of forests gave way to the sprawling suburbs, and finally to the urban outskirts of New York. "It's like we entered a painting," she murmured, with a smile of pure joy that made Emmett completely forget the financial report he had on his tablet. "Wait until you really fly," he responded, and then bit his tongue when he saw her expression cloud slightly. "Sorry, I didn't mean—" "No, it's okay," she interrupted him, turning to face him with a direct look. "You need to stop apologizing for your life, Emmett. Don't apologize for having privileges, just use them consciously." The wisdom in those words, coming from a 25-year-old woman who had known so little of the world, left him speechless. They spent the rest of the flight in comfortable silence, he occasionally working while she read a tourist guide to New York she'd bought at the airport, marking places with a pencil. The plaza was a revelatory experience for both. For Maeve, it was a world of luxuries she could barely comprehend: original artwork, designer furniture, sheets that felt like clouds. For Emmett, it was seeing this world through her eyes, realizing how much he had taken for granted. "There are entire families that could live a year on what one night here costs," she commented softly as they went up in the elevator. No judgment in her voice, just a statement of facts. "I know," he responded, feeling strangely ashamed. "Does it make you uncomfortable?" Maeve reflected for a moment before answering. "It makes me feel aware of fortune and misfortune, of how capricious fate is. I could have been born into your world, or you into mine. It's just luck, chance, or destiny," he added softly. She looked at him with curiosity. "Do you believe in destiny?" "I didn't before," he admitted, as the elevator doors opened on their floor. "But since I met you, I'm starting to think maybe there are things written beyond our decisions." The auction at the Botanical Garden was a fascinating spectacle. Maeve transformed completely, her shyness evaporating as she examined rare specimens of native and exotic flora. Emmett watched in wonder as she conversed with botanical experts from across the country, how her eyes sparkled when she identified a particularly rare species of orchid endemic to the Smoky Mountains. "You should bid on that one," Emmett whispered, pointing to a small dogwood tree that was particularly beautiful. "Are you crazy?" "It costs over $1,000, she replied, horrified. "And you'd make it flourish in a way that would be worth 10 times more." Trust me, the disbelief on Maeve's face when he bid and won the dogwood was priceless. When the hammer fell adjudicating the plant to them, She looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, something that made Emmet's heart race. "You didn't have to do that," she said later, as they walked through the paths of the historic garden, the sun filtering through the canopy of centuries-old trees. "I wanted to," he replied simply. "I wanted to see that light in your eyes." They stopped under a magnificent oak, its earthy scent filling the air. Maeve turned to him, and for the first time, there were no barriers in her expression. "I'm starting to get scared," she confessed, "of what I'm feeling, of how fast it's happening, of how different we are, and yet, when we're together, none of that seems to matter," he completed, closing the distance between them. "I'm scared too, Maeve. I've spent 20 years controlling every aspect of my life, and with you I can't control anything, especially my own feelings." A group of tourists passed by them, breaking the moment. But something had changed. A line had been crossed. When that night they returned to the hotel, they didn't separate in the hallway. Instead, Emmet walked her to her door, and for an eternal moment, they simply looked at each other. "Good night, Maeve," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "Good night, Emmet," she responded. But before entering, she did something that completely surprised him. She stood on her toes and gave him a soft kiss on the cheek, leaving the scent of natural jasmine that always surrounded her. As Emmet entered his own room, he touched the cheek where she had kissed him, smiling like a teenager. In the room next door, Maeve leaned against the closed door, her heart beating so loudly she was sure he could hear it through the wall. Because true love doesn't announce its arrival with fanfare, but infiltrates gently, conquering territories of the heart we believed fortified, until one day we discover we are no longer the same. The real conflict erupted 2 weeks after the New York trip, during a charity gala at Emmet's penthouse in Manhattan. He had insisted so much that Maeve had finally yielded, though every fiber of her being screamed that this wasn't her place. The penthouse on the Upper East Side was an architectural masterpiece, a perfect combination of modern New York sophistication and contemporary luxury. Emmet had hired a personal stylist for Maeve, who arrived with 3 dresses from designers she could barely pronounce. She chose the simplest, a light blue design from Carolina Herrera that floated around her body like liquid water, enhancing her figure without being ostentatious. When Maeve descended the marble staircase, all eyes turned to her. Emmet, who was in conversation with a senator, literally lost his train of thought. She was an ethereal vision, her natural beauty magnified by the elegant dress, but without losing that earthy quality that made her unique. "You look," he began when she reached his side, unable to complete the sentence. "Ridiculous," Maeve whispered, with a nervous smile. "I feel like an imposter." "Perfect," he corrected, taking her hand and kissing it gently. "You look perfect." The first 2 hours transpired in a surreal haze. Maeve found herself balancing between conversations about real estate investments, national politics, and market trends she understood nothing about. Emmet remained constantly by her side, introducing her with pride as my most talented gardening consultant, though his eyes said much more. Then Victoria Whitmore appeared. The woman was the epitome of Manhattan elegance. 45 but looking 35, thanks to the best surgeons in New York, dressed in a red Valentino that probably cost more than Maeve's car, and with a smile that didn't reach her cold steel-gray eyes. "Emmet, darling," she purred, kissing him on both cheeks with familiarity. "What a surprise to see you here with—" Her eyes traveled over Maeve from top to bottom with barely disguised disdain. "Such quaint company." Emmet tensed immediately. "Victoria, meet Maeve Calloway. Maeve, Victoria Whitmore, a former business associate." "Former associate," Victoria repeated with a crystalline laugh. "What a polite way to put it. But yes, I suppose after that unfortunate dispute over the Boston project, we no longer do business together." She turned to Maeve with a predatory smile. "And you, dear? What line of business are you in? Modeling? Influencing?" "I'm a gardener," Maeve responded, raising her chin with dignity. Though Emmet could see how her hands trembled slightly, the silence that followed was deafening. Several nearby people turned their heads, and Maeve felt the blush rising up her neck. "Oh," Victoria elongated the word, her tone dripping with condescension. "How charming. I suppose someone has to take care of those things, right? Though I thought that's what service staff were for." Or perhaps... Her look became malicious. Oh, I understand. How modern you are, Emmett, mixing with the help. Enough! Emmett's voice cut the air like a whip, cold and lethal. Get out of my home, now! Victoria blinked, genuinely surprised. What? Emmett, I was only joking. Out, he repeated, each word like a piece of ice. And you can forget about the Miami project you asked me to consider. I won't do business with someone who insults people I care about. The murmur of shock rippled through the room. Everyone knew the Miami project was worth tens of millions of dollars. Victoria paled, realizing too late she had gone too far. Emmett, please, don't be ridiculous. For this... But Maeve had already released Emmett's hand and was walking quickly toward the terrace doors, her heels clicking on the marble floor, fighting to contain tears until she was out of everyone's sight. Emmett followed her, completely ignoring Victoria and the 200 guests watching the drama unfold. He found her in the private garden, under a cherry tree in bloom, arms crossed over her chest, looking at the Manhattan lights twinkling in the distance. Maeve, don't, she raised a hand without turning. Don't say anything, she's right. What am I doing here? I'm a hillbilly from Appalachia who barely finished high school. I don't belong in this world of champagne that costs hundreds of dollars a bottle and dresses that cost more than my yearly salary. That doesn't matter, Emmett approached, placing his hands on her shoulders gently. None of that matters. She finally turned, and he saw tears shining in her eyes under the moonlight. Doesn't it? Really doesn't it? Her voice broke. Because you just lost a multi-million-dollar deal because of me. You just humiliated a powerful woman in your own home, in front of Manhattan's elite. How long until you regret it? How long until you realize I'm just a gardener who will never understand your world? Emmett gripped her shoulders, forcing her to look directly at him. Listen to me, he said with an intensity that left her breathless. Victoria Whitmore can go to hell. That whole world can go to hell. I spent 20 years building an empire, accumulating money, earning respect. And for what? To be surrounded by people like her. People who only value me for what I can do for them. And then you appear with dirt under your nails and flowers in your hair, and suddenly that whole world seems empty and meaningless. But there are no buts, he interrupted. Yes, I lost a deal. I'll lose many more if it means protecting you. Yes, I humiliated Victoria, and I'd do it 1,000 times more, because for the first time in my life, I found something more valuable than any property, any contract, any bank account. I found someone who makes me want to be better, who makes me feel real, who makes me believe there's still beauty and goodness in this cynical world. The tears finally overflowed Maeve's cheeks, but this time they weren't just from pain, but also from something deeper, more hopeful. I'm so scared, she whispered. Scared of not being enough, scared of disappointing you, scared of falling in love with you and losing myself in this world I don't understand. Emmett pulled her close gently, letting her rest her head on his chest, stroking her hair tenderly. Then let's be scared together, he murmured against her hair. But let's not give up. Give me a chance, Maeve. Give me the chance to show you this love can work, that we can build a bridge between our worlds. In the distance, the gala music continued, but there, under the New York stars and the intoxicating scent of jasmine, two people from different worlds sealed a silent pact to fight for something everyone else considered impossible. Because true courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it, betting on love even when all odds are against you. The following months brought seismic changes to Maeve's life. Emmett, true to his word, had begun building bridges between their worlds, but in ways she had never anticipated. First came education, not imposed, but offered as a gift. One September morning, Emmett presented her with an acceptance to study advanced botany at Duke University, a prestigious program that had been impossible for her due to costs. I can't accept this, Maeve had said, the letter trembling in her hands as they sat on the terrace of the Charleston estate, the morning sun bathing them in golden light. Why not? He asked, genuinely confused. Because you've already given me too much. The increased salary, the trips, the dresses. I feel like I'm selling myself. Emmett had taken her face between his hands with a tenderness that disarmed her. Maeve, do you love me? The question caught her completely off guard. They had danced around that feeling for months, but had never explicitly named it. Yes, she finally admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Yes, I love you. And I love you, he responded with absolute conviction, but this isn't because of that. It's because you have a genuine talent that deserves to be cultivated, because when you talk about plants, your eyes light up in a way that's pure magic, because the world needs more people like you, who understand that nature isn't just a resource, but a treasure we must protect. And so, with tears of gratitude, Maeve had enrolled. The first weeks were brutal. She felt completely out of place among students 10 years younger, many from wealthy families from across the South. Her classmates arrived talking about trips to Europe, summers at lake houses, while she could barely contribute anecdotes from her mountain community. But something extraordinary happened. She discovered she had a base of practical knowledge none of them possessed. While the others recited scientific names from memory, she intuitively understood life cycles, the needs of each species, the subtle signs of disease or flourishing. Slowly, she began to gain confidence and even admiration. It was during this period that she also discovered photography. Emmett had gifted her a professional camera after seeing her try to capture the beauty of a sunrise over the garden with her old phone. At first, Maeve had protested, another extravagant gift, but he had insisted. It's not extravagant if it feeds your soul, he had argued. And he was right. Photography became her way of documenting her transformation. She captured the golden southern light on magnolia leaves, morning dew on a gardenia, the textures of century-old tree bark. But she also began photographing people, wrinkled faces of elderly people at Savannah's farmers' market, working hands of fishermen, smiles of children playing in public fountains. Emmett had her best works framed and hung them in the corridors of his Manhattan penthouse, replacing abstract art that had never meant anything to him. Visitors were stunned by the raw beauty and emotion the photographs conveyed. "Who's the artist?" they constantly asked. "Someone who sees the world with eyes the rest of us have lost," he would respond with pride. But Maeve's deepest transformation came when she began teaching. The university had offered her the opportunity to give practical workshops to first-year students, sharing her intuitive knowledge of southern gardening. Initially terrified at the idea of standing in front of a class, she had discovered she had a natural gift for transmitting her passion. It was after one of those workshops, in late October, when a senior professor approached her. "Miss Calloway, have you ever considered working with rural communities?" asked Professor Harrison, a 70-year-old man with a legendary reputation in applied botany. "We have a sustainable development program in Appalachian communities. We need people like you, who understand both the science and the reality of these communities." That night, when Maeve told Emmett about the offer, she saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Pure pride, unmixed with possessiveness or fear. "You should do it," he said immediately. "It's perfect for you. But it would mean spending entire weeks in the mountains away from you. And you'd be fulfilling your purpose," he interrupted gently. "Maeve, one of the things I love most about you is your ability to connect with people, to make them feel they matter. Those rural communities need that, and you need to know you're valuable for yourself, not just as the millionaire's girlfriend." The words hit her forcefully. It was the first time he explicitly acknowledged the elephant in the room. That part of her insecurity came from feeling her worth was tied to his. She accepted the project. For the next 6 weeks, Maeve lived among communities nestled in the Appalachian Mountains, teaching farmers sustainable cultivation techniques, helping establish community gardens, documenting endangered native species. She stayed in residents' homes, ate simple meals, worked under the relentless sun, and flourished. Emmett visited on weekends when he could, arriving in his luxury car to towns where chickens blocked narrow streets. The residents, initially suspicious of the rich outsider, were surprised to see how he rolled up the sleeves of his designer shirt and helped in the community garden, how he listened with genuine interest to the elders' stories, how he treated Maeve with a respect and adoration that transcended social barriers. "Your man is good," said a 90-year-old woman, the same age as Maeve's grandmother. "Rich, yes, but good. Eyes don't lie. He looks at you like other men look at treasures." One night, sitting on the roof of a log cabin, under a starry sky so bright it seemed unreal, Maeve took Emmett's hand. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" he asked, confused. "For letting me find myself. for not trying to mold me into something that fit your world, but for giving me the tools to build my own, for loving me enough to risk that. By finding my independence, I'd leave you behind." Emmett looked at her with an intensity that took her breath away. "I was never afraid of that," he lied, but both knew the truth. "Well, maybe a little, but I understood something fundamental. If I hold you back out of fear, I'll lose you anyway. If I set you free and you choose to return, then I know it's real." They kissed under the stars, surrounded by the song of crickets and the scent of wild thyme, and it was different from all previous kisses. It was a kiss of equals, of two people who had found themselves and now consciously chose to find each other. Because true love is not a gilded cage, but a shared garden where both people can grow, flourish, and be fully themselves. The true test of fire came in December, when Emmett's entire family decided to make their annual Christmas visit. Marcus, the older brother from Boston, was a conservative banker with very firm opinions about appropriate social associations. Claire, the younger sister, was a socialite from Connecticut, known for her sharp tongue and impossible standards. And then there was their mother, Eleanor Ashford, a formidable matriarch who had built as much of the family empire as her late husband. Emmett had postponed this encounter as long as he could, but there were no more excuses. They had agreed to meet at the mountain lodge he had recently purchased near Asheville, North Carolina, an impressive property with views of the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was neutral territory, far from both the Charleston estate that had become their refuge and the corporate offices in Manhattan. Maeve had spent an entire week preparing, consulting with Emmett about protocols, practicing conversation topics, carefully choosing her clothes. Elegant but not pretentious, expensive but not obviously so. Despite all her newfound confidence, the prospect of being judged by his family terrified her. "Relax," Emmett had said that morning as she changed outfits for the 5th time. "You're not being interviewed for a position. You're yourself, and that's more than enough." Easy for him to say. The family arrived in convoy, 2 latest model BMWs and a Range Rover. Maeve watched them descend from the vehicles from the 2nd-floor window, her heart pounding like a drum. Marcus was Emmett's image, but 10 years older and twice as severe. Claire was elegant to the core, with that air of superiority only generational wealth can buy. And Eleanor. Eleanor was small but imposing, with perfectly styled white hair and eyes that seemed to see straight into the soul. Lunch was tense from the start. Maeve had insisted on helping prepare the food, working alongside the local cook Emmett had hired. She had made a traditional Appalachian stew using her grandmother's recipe, cornbread from scratch, and had coordinated a menu that was authentically regional but sophisticated. "So you're the gardener," were Marcus's first words, said without real malice but with an involuntary condescension that made Maeve straighten instinctively. "I'm a botanist, specializing in native southeastern flora," she corrected gently but firmly. "Currently working with Duke University on rural sustainable development programs." Marcus blinked, clearly not expecting that response. "Ah, well, that sounds useful." "It is," Emmett intervened with an edge in his voice. "Maeve is doing real work, work that matters, not just moving numbers on spreadsheets." The blow was deliberate. Marcus flushed, but before he could respond, Eleanor intervened. "Tell me about your family, dear," she said, her voice neutral but penetrating. Maeve took a deep breath. This was the moment she'd feared. "I was raised by my grandmother in a mountain community in Appalachia, Mrs. Ashford. My parents died when I was young. We didn't have much in material terms, but my grandmother taught me values that—" She hesitated, then decided to be completely honest. "Values that sometimes I feel this world has forgotten. Dignity regardless of circumstances. Integrity even when no one is watching. And that true wealth is measured in relationships, not possessions." The silence that followed was absolute. Claire stopped pretending interest in her phone. Marcus looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. And Eleanor had tears shining in her eyes. "My God," the matriarch whispered, "you sound exactly like my husband's mother. She also came from a mountain community. She also taught us those values before money made us forget who we were." The emotion at the table transformed instantly. Eleanor began to talk, to the surprise of her own children, about her humble origins in a working-class neighborhood of Boston, about how she and her husband had worked with their hands before building their empire, about how they had sworn never to forget where they came from, and then had done exactly that. "We raised our children in luxury," she admitted, looking at Marcus and Claire with a mixture of love and sadness. "We thought we were giving them advantages, but we took away something fundamental: appreciation for simple things, connection to the earth, understanding that character matters more than status." Marcus looked uncomfortable, but when he finally spoke, his voice was softer. "Maeve, I must apologize. I came here with prejudices. I assumed you were... Well, it doesn't matter what I assumed, but I just saw my brother." He looked at Emmett with something like wonder. "Truly happy for the first time in years. And that's worth more than any business merger or multi-million-dollar contract." Claire was harder to convince. For the rest of the day she maintained a polite but cold distance. It was only in the afternoon, when she found Maeve in the lodge garden photographing the last winter roses under the golden evening light, that barriers began to fall. "They're beautiful," Claire commented, approaching cautiously. "The photographs Emmett has in Manhattan, you took them, didn't you?" Maeve nodded, not stopping her camera adjustments. "Photography helps me see. Not just look, but really see. Beauty is everywhere, even in places people consider ordinary." Claire sat on a nearby stone bench, and for the first time, Maeve saw vulnerability in her perfectly made-up face. "I've traveled all over the world," Claire said softly. "The best hotels, the best beaches, the best art galleries, and yet I can't remember the last time I really saw something beautiful, felt something deep. Everything is just experiences to post on Instagram, stories to tell at cocktail parties. Nothing is real." Maeve lowered her camera and looked directly at the woman. "It's never too late to reconnect with what's real," she said simply. That evening during dinner, something extraordinary happened. Eleanor asked Maeve to serve the stew she had prepared herself, saying she wanted to experience the food as it was meant to be shared, with love and personal attention. The formality of table service dissolved, and in its place emerged something more like a true family meal. Marcus told stories of his childhood in Boston, of how they used to fish for trout in streams. Claire admitted to everyone's surprise that she had been considering retiring from the social scene and seriously studying art history. Eleanor cried openly while remembering her husband, sharing facets of him that her own children had never known. And Emmett, observing all this, understood something fundamental. Maeve hadn't just changed him, she was beginning to transform his entire family, reminding them of who they had been before money and status distorted them. When the family left 2 days later, Eleanor hugged Maeve with genuine affection. "Take care of my son," she whispered in her ear. "But more importantly, don't let him or us change you. Keep that light, that authenticity. It reminds us of what we've lost, and perhaps what we can still recover." As the vehicles pulled away down the gravel road, Emmett hugged Maeve from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "You did it," he murmured. "You won them over." "It wasn't a conquest," she responded, leaning into him. "It was a reminder that under all the layers of money and sophistication, we're all human searching for the same things: love, connection, purpose. Because true families aren't built on blood or money, but on mutual recognition of shared values and the willingness to grow together." January brought the crisis Maeve had subconsciously feared from the beginning. Emmett's empire, so solid and apparently invulnerable, began showing cracks. It all started with a phone call at 3 in the morning. Maeve woke to the sound of Emmett's phone vibrating insistently on the nightstand. He answered with a sleepy voice that quickly transformed into something hard and alarmed. "How much?" he asked, already jumping out of bed. "No, I don't care about the time. Call an emergency meeting, all principal partners, in 2 hours in Manhattan." After hanging up, he stood by the window of their bedroom in the Charleston estate, staring at the dark ocean, his back tense and fists clenched. "What happened?" Maeve asked, wrapping a robe around herself. "The luxury property market on the coast just collapsed," he responded, his voice flat, but loaded with tension. "A group of Chinese investors suddenly withdrew billions from the American market. 3 of my biggest projects are now underwater financially. I could lose—" He stopped, running a hand through his hair. "I could lose everything." Over the next 3 weeks, Maeve barely saw Emmett. He was constantly moving. Manhattan, Boston, London, Frankfurt. Endless meetings, calls at all hours, desperate negotiations. When he returned home, it was only to sleep a few hours before leaving again, and in those brief moments, she saw the transformation in him. Deep circles under his eyes, constantly clenched jaw, the return of that calculating coldness he had worked so hard to soften. Maeve tried to help in her way. She prepared nutritious meals he barely touched. She offered to listen when he needed to vent. But as days turned into weeks, she felt the distance between them growing, not physical, but emotional. The worst part was the loneliness. Maeve found herself alone again in the estate, surrounded by luxuries that now seemed empty without his presence. She tried to stay busy with university work, with photography projects, but doubts began to infiltrate like poisonous ivy. Was this what it meant to love someone from his world? Weeks of loneliness interrupted by fleeting encounters, always being second priority after business. And most terrifying, what would happen if Emmett lost his empire? Who would he be without money and power? Would he still love her, or had she been just a fantasy his secure life had allowed him to entertain? These questions tormented her during lonely nights, listening to the murmur of the ocean, the same ocean she had known all her life, but that now sounded different, colder, more indifferent. The breaking point came one February night. Emmett had promised to return for a special dinner. It was their anniversary, 1 year since they'd met. Maeve had spent the entire day preparing an elaborate meal, using her grandmother's recipes, filling the estate with aromas from her childhood. She had worn the blue dress he loved so much, lit candles created the perfect atmosphere. But Emmett didn't arrive. At 8, Maeve received a text message. "Sorry, crucial meeting with Middle Eastern investors. Can't cancel. I'll make it up to you. I'll make it up to you." As if his presence, his time, his love were business transactions that could be postponed and compensated for later. Maeve blew out the candles one by one, watching the smoke rise in grey spirals. She wrapped the food and stored it in the refrigerator. She took off the blue dress and put on her work clothes. And then, without thinking much, she did something she hadn't done in months. She called her grandmother. "My girl." The elderly voice sounded worried. "I've missed you. You don't call as much anymore." "I know, Grandma, I'm sorry." Maeve's voice broke. "It's just, I got a little lost in this world that isn't mine." "Then come home," her grandmother said simply. "You can always come home." Those words echoed in Maeve throughout the night. Could she simply return? Go back to her simple but authentic life in Appalachia, leave behind this complicated and terrifying love for something safer, more understandable. But then she thought of Emmett, of the man she had known behind the magnate, of moments shared under starry skies, of conversations that had reached her soul. Could she simply abandon him in his darkest moment? When Emmett finally arrived 3 days later, he found Maeve in the garden, where he always found her, but something was different. She didn't run to hug him, didn't smile with that warmth that always melted him. Instead, she looked at him with an expression he couldn't completely decipher. It wasn't anger, it was something deeper, more serious. "I'm sorry," he began immediately. "About the anniversary, about these weeks, about—" "I need to ask you something," she interrupted him. "And I need you to be completely honest with me." Emmett nodded, a bad feeling forming in his stomach. "What are we, Emmett? Really? When there's no crisis, when your life is stable, you seek me out, you make me feel special, you make me believe I can be part of your world, but as soon as things get difficult, you disappear. So am I your partner, or am I just a pleasant escape from the pressures of your real life?" The words hit him like physical punches. He opened his mouth to protest, but stopped, because there was truth in what she was saying, a truth he had avoided facing. "I don't know how to do this," he finally admitted, his voice broken. "I've spent 20 years prioritizing business over everything else. It's what I know how to do, it's who I am. And now, facing the possibility of losing everything, I'm terrified. Not of losing the money, but of losing my identity. Who am I without my empire? What do I have to offer you if I'm not the successful magnate?" Maeve approached slowly, taking his face between her hands. "That's exactly the wrong question," she said softly. "The right question is, who are you with, or without the empire? Are you the man who taught me to dream beyond my garden? The man who protected my dignity without thinking twice? The man who knelt in dirty earth because he knew that's what mattered to me?" Emmett closed his eyes, letting the tears he had repressed for weeks finally fall. "I'm so afraid," he whispered. "Afraid of failing, of disappointing you, of discovering that without the money I'm nothing interesting." "Then let's face that fear together," she responded. "But Emmett, you need to understand something. I chose you, not your bank account. I'll choose you when you're at the top and when you're at the bottom. But I can't choose a ghost. I can't love someone who disappears every time life gets difficult." He hugged her then, tightly, desperately, as if she were a lifeline in the middle of a stormy ocean. And perhaps she was. Perhaps she was exactly what he needed, not comfort or escape, but a mirror that forced him to face who he truly was. Because crises don't destroy true love, they simply reveal whether it was ever real to begin with, whether it has deep roots or is just a beautiful sandcastle waiting for the first tide. March brought confirmation of Emmett's worst fears. The financial crisis had not only affected his luxury property investments, but had triggered a series of devastating events. 3 of his principal partners withdrew their support, several multi-million-dollar contracts were cancelled, and banks began pressing for payment of loans he had taken during his aggressive expansion in recent years. The decisive meeting took place in Manhattan, in the glass boardroom overlooking the Hudson River, where so much of Emmett's success had been forged. Maeve had insisted on accompanying him, despite his protests, saying simply, "This is what we're together for, isn't it? For the difficult moments." She observed from a corner, while Emmett presented his restructuring plan to a group of stone-faced investors. She watched how he transformed his desperation into determination, arguing with the strategic brilliance that had taken him to the top. But she also saw something else. She saw the exact moment when he understood it wasn't going to work, when hope faded from his eyes. "Mr. Ashford," said the consortium leader, a 60-year-old Swiss man with a clinical voice, "we appreciate your presentation, but the reality is clear. You've overextended your operations. You need to liquidate at least 40% of your assets to stabilize your situation. Otherwise, we'll be forced to exercise our contractual rights. 40%. The number floated in the air like a death sentence. Emmett remained motionless for a moment that seemed eternal. Then, with a dignity Maeve would never forget, he nodded. "I understand. You'll have my decision in 48 hours. Back at the estate that night, Emmett didn't speak. He simply drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched. Maeve didn't try to fill the silence with empty words of comfort. She knew some wounds need to bleed before they can begin to heal. But when they arrived and he went straight to his private study, closing the door behind him, she knew she couldn't leave him alone in that abyss. She waited an hour, then 2, watching Charleston's lights twinkle in the distance. Finally, when the clock struck 2 in the morning, she knocked softly on the study door. "Go away, Maeve." His voice sounded dead. "I'm not in the mood." She opened the door anyway. Emmett was sitting on the floor, his back against the mahogany desk, surrounded by financial papers and bottles of whiskey. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and there was an expression on his face she'd never seen. Absolute defeat. "I told you to go away," he repeated, but without conviction. Maeve sat beside him on the floor, not caring about wrinkling the dress she wore. "What was your dream?" she asked instead. "Before all this, before the money and power, what did you want to be?" He looked at her as if she'd spoken in an alien language. I don't know. That was so long ago." "Then help me understand something," she continued gently. "All these properties you're about to lose, all these investments, did any of them make you happy? Or were they just numbers on a spreadsheet, proof of your success?" Emmett remained silent for a long moment. Finally he laughed, but it was a bitter, empty laugh. "You want to know the truth, the fucking truth? I spent 2 decades accumulating properties I never visit, money I never spend on anything meaningful, power that only brought me loneliness. And only now, when I'm about to lose it all, do I realize the only thing that truly matters in this world is you. And I'm so pathetic I don't even know how to show you without the shield of my money." Maeve felt tears burning her eyes, but she held them back. "Then show me now, without the money, without the power. Just you." Emmett looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw in his eyes something raw and terrified. "What if there's nothing underneath? What if I've been empty all this time and simply disguised it with material success?" "Then we'll fill it together," she responded, taking his hand. "But Emmett, you need to listen to me. I'm not here for your money. I never was. I'm here for the man who stopped in a garden when he saw someone crying, even though he had 1,000 more important things to do. For the man who risked business relationships to defend my dignity. For the man who learned to get his hands dirty in the earth because he knew it was important to me. But that man had money, he insisted, almost desperately. He had options. He had control. Without that, who am I? Maeve knelt in front of him, forcing him to look directly at her. You're the man who's going to get up tomorrow and face whatever consequences come. You're the man who's going to learn that failure isn't the end of the world, but an opportunity to rebuild from truth instead of from ego. You're the man who's finally going to discover who he is when all the masks fall. The conversation continued until dawn. Emmett talked about things he'd never shared with anyone. His fear of not being enough, his obsession with success as a form of validation, his deep loneliness under all the opulence. And Maeve listened without judging, only offering her constant presence. When the sun began to illuminate the horizon, Emmett finally fell asleep, his head in her lap, while Maeve stroked his hair and watched the sunrise over the Atlantic. And in that moment, she made a decision. No matter what came, no matter how much he lost, she would stay. Not because it was easy, but precisely because it was difficult. Because true love wasn't just sharing successes, but being the anchor when everything else collapses. Because the darkest moments aren't those where everything is lost, but those where we must decide if we have the courage to continue without guarantees of victory. The decision Emmett made in the following 48 hours surprised everyone, including Maeve. And with the resulting capital, instead of paying debts and keeping the rest of the empire intact, he decided to divide the money into 3 parts. 1/3 to resolve all financial obligations completely, 1/3 to create an educational fund that would offer scholarships to students from rural communities, to study careers related to environmental conservation and botany, and the last third to establish a network of sustainable community gardening centers in small towns across the South. Instead of simply liquidating 40% of his assets as they had demanded, he decided to do something much more radical. Sell 60%, not out of obligation, but by choice. You've completely lost your mind, Marcus told him during a tense call. You could save yourself. Keep at least a substantial part of your empire. Why the hell would you give it all away? Emmett looked at Maeve, who was sitting across from him in the garden of the estate, her hands stained with earth after spending the morning working on the flower beds. She didn't yet know about his decision. Because for the first time in my life, I want to build something that has meaning beyond my own bank account, he responded. When he told Maeve that night, her reaction wasn't what he expected. It wasn't immediate joy or pride. Instead, she became very quiet, processing. Why? She finally asked. Why are you doing this? For you, he responded without hesitation. Because you showed me what truly matters. Because I want to be the man who deserves your love, not the magnate who dazzles you with luxuries. Maeve moved away from him, walking toward the edge of the terrace where the ocean was visible in the distance, dark under the growing moonlight. No, she said softly but firmly. No, Emmett, you can't do this for me. He frowned, confused and a little hurt. What do you mean? I thought it would make you happy that... Exactly. She turned to him, her eyes shining with intense emotion. You thought it would make me happy, but you didn't think about whether it makes you happy. Emmett, I don't need you to destroy your life to prove your love. I need you to build the life you want to live, to find your purpose beyond me or anyone else. The words resonated in the night silence. Emmett felt as if he'd just hit an invisible wall. But it's what I want, he insisted, though his voice sounded less convinced than before. I want to do something meaningful, something that matters. Really? Maeve approached him, taking his face between her hands. Or are you trying to become what you think I want you to be? Because if that's the case, Emmett, eventually you'll resent it. You'll blame me for the life you left behind, and that resentment will destroy us more effectively than any social or financial difference. The truth in her words hit him forcefully. Throughout the night, Maeve made him talk, really talk about what he wanted. She made him question every decision, explore the real motivations behind his radical plan. And what they discovered together was complex. Yes, part of him genuinely wanted to do something meaningful, but another part was trying to atone for guilt, to prove he was worthy of her love, to transform himself completely into someone different because he had decided who he was before wasn't enough. "The point isn't that you become me," Maeve said passionately. "The point is that we find a way to integrate our worlds without either of us losing who we are. You're a brilliant businessman, Emmett. You have a gift for business, for seeing opportunities where others see obstacles. You shouldn't destroy that. You should redirect it towards something that aligns with your values." During the next week, they worked together on a new version of the plan. Emmett would still sell enough assets to resolve his obligations and regain financial stability. But instead of simply giving away the rest, he would create social enterprises. Businesses that were profitable, but with purpose. Eco-tourism developments that respected the local environment. Affordable housing projects that used sustainable architecture. Investments in agricultural startups that promoted organic techniques. "It's the best of both worlds," he explained during a revised presentation to the investor consortium. "Profitability with purpose. I'm not abandoning business, I'm evolving it." To many people's surprise, the proposal was received with genuine interest. Several investors, especially younger ones, saw the potential not only for financial returns, but also for social impact. The market was changing, they told him, and increasingly conscious consumers preferred brands with values. But the real turning point came when Maeve asked a simple question one night while they were in bed. The lights off, only moonlight illuminating the room. "If you had to choose between losing me or losing all your money, what would you choose?" Emmett became completely still. It was an impossible question, designed to reveal uncomfortable truths. "You," he finally responded without hesitation. "I'd choose you without thinking twice. Even if it meant you'd resent me, even if it meant becoming someone you no longer recognize." He understood then what she was really saying. "Those aren't the only options, are they?" he said slowly. "I don't have to choose between being who I was completely or transforming completely. I can evolve. I can keep the best of me while incorporating the best of you." Maeve nestled against him, and there was relief in her voice. "Exactly. I don't want to change you, Emmett. I want to grow with you. And that means we both keep our essences while learning from each other." As he fell asleep that night, Emmett understood something fundamental. The true sacrifice wasn't renouncing who he was, but having the courage to evolve into who he could become. Because transformative love doesn't destroy but perfects, doesn't erase but refines, doesn't demand we leave behind who we are, but challenges us to become the best versions of ourselves. April brought a new season, and with it, the feeling that life was beginning again. Emmett had completed the restructuring of his empire. Smaller, yes, but more focused, more ethical, more aligned with values he had recently rediscovered. The most surprising thing was discovering he didn't miss what he'd lost as much as he'd feared. The ostentatious properties, the private jets, the obscene bank accounts. Now that they were gone, he realized how much energy he'd spent maintaining them, worrying about them, defining himself through them. But it wasn't an easy or linear process. There were bad days, moments of panic when he saw his reduced financial statements, when he received invitations to elite events he could no longer afford to attend with the same style, when former associates avoided him as if financial failure were contagious. On one of those particularly difficult days, Maeve found him in the garden of the estate, staring at the ocean without really seeing it. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked without preamble. "Meeting me, getting involved in all this mess." Maeve sat beside him on the stone bench, her physical proximity an immediate comfort. "Every day," she responded honestly, and he turned to her in shock. "I regret not meeting you sooner. I regret every day we lived without knowing each other, every moment you spent alone in your empty world, and every moment I spent limited in mine. But regret meeting you. Never." It was during this period of reconstruction that Emmett finally met Maeve's grandmother. The elderly woman, 90 years old but with astonishing lucidity, had traveled from Appalachia specifically to evaluate him. Maeve had tried to warn him, but nothing could have prepared him for the encounter. "So you're the one who has my granddaughter living in sin," were the grandmother's first words, said without real malice, but with a frankness that made Emmett blush like a teenager. "Grandma," Maeve began, mortified. "Let him speak," the elderly woman interrupted, pinning her dark eyes on Emmett. I want to hear what he has to say for himself. Emmett took a deep breath. This tiny, elderly woman, in her traditional black dress and headscarf, was more intimidating than any room full of corporate executives. You're right, he admitted, and I have no excuse except that I've been a coward. I've been so focused on rebuilding my life that I haven't thought about formalizing my commitment to your granddaughter in the way she deserves. The grandmother raised an eyebrow. And what does my granddaughter deserve, according to you? Everything, he responded without hesitation. She deserves someone who values her not as an escape from his boring life, but as the center of his universe. She deserves to be chosen every day, not just with words, but with actions. She deserves a family that respects her, a life that fulfills her, and a partner who grows with her instead of trying to change or limit her. There was a long silence. Then, to everyone's surprise, the grandmother smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her wrinkled face. Good, she said simply. Then let's talk about a wedding. What followed was one of the most surreal conversations of Emmett's life. The grandmother, with Maeve occasionally translating from thick Appalachian dialect, explained exactly what kind of ceremony she expected. A traditional wedding in the mountain community where Maeve had grown up, with the local preacher, followed by a celebration that honored the customs and community that had shaped her granddaughter. None of those ostentatious weddings in Manhattan or Boston, she warned. My granddaughter is mountain folk, and that's where she should marry if she's going to marry proper. Emmett, the man who had attended multi-million-dollar weddings in Monaco and Malibu, found he had no desire to contradict her. In fact, the idea of a simple and authentic wedding appealed to him deeply. But also, the grandmother continued, her eyes becoming softer, I also want you to do something for yourself, a celebration for your family and your world. Because a wedding isn't just joining two people, it's joining two worlds. The wisdom in those words resonated deeply with Emmett. Over the following weeks, while the grandmother stayed with them, he watched fascinated as Maeve flourished under her presence. The two women spent hours together in the garden, talking in their dialect, laughing with stories he didn't fully understand but enjoyed hearing. And the grandmother, in her direct but loving way, began teaching him too. She showed him how to make traditional cornbread, how to prepare fish as they had in her family for generations, how to find value in simplicity, but more importantly, she taught about love through stories of her own 60-year marriage to a coal miner who had died when Maeve was still a child. True love isn't constant passion, she told him one afternoon, as the three of them had coffee on the terrace. It's constant choice. There are days when love is easy, when your partner makes you feel like you're walking on clouds, and there are days when love is work, when you have to actively choose to be patient, to be understanding, to be generous when every fiber of your being wants to be selfish. And how did you know on those difficult days that it was worth it? Emmett asked. The grandmother looked at Maeve with so much love that Emmett felt a lump in his throat. Because I could never imagine my life without him. I could imagine an easier life, a more comfortable one, even a momentarily happier one. But I couldn't imagine a more real, more complete life. And that's the difference. During the time the grandmother stayed with them, Emmett realized he was receiving something no amount of money could buy. The blessing and wisdom of a matriarch who had lived long enough to understand what truly mattered. When it finally came time for the grandmother to return to Appalachia, she insisted on not being a burden any longer. Emmett hugged her with genuine affection. You'll take care of her, won't you? It wasn't really a question. With my life, he promised. And you've given me something invaluable, a vision of who she is at her essence, where her strength comes from. Thank you. As they watched the car pull away, Maeve rested her head on Emmett's shoulder. She loves you, she said softly. I can see it. I was so worried she wouldn't approve, but I think she sees something in you that I see. The potential to be extraordinary, not for what you have, but for who you choose to be. And Emmett, for the first time in his life, felt he was finally living up to that potential. Because true validation doesn't come from accumulating successes or impressing crowds, but from earning the respect of those who know the true value of things, who have lived long enough to distinguish the authentic from the superficial. May had transformed the estate garden into an explosive paradise of color and fragrance. The magnolias bloomed with intoxicating intensity, the gardenias reached their moment of maximum beauty, and the dogwood that Emmett had bought for Maeve in New York had now grown enough to begin bearing its first flowers. It was a perfect evening, with the sky painted in shades of gold, orange, and violet. When Emmett finally executed the plan he had been meticulously preparing for weeks. It had all begun with a conversation with his brother Marcus, of all people. Their relationship, formerly cordial but distant, had deepened during the financial crisis. Marcus had been unexpectedly supportive, offering advice without condescension, contacts without obligations. And one night, after one glass of wine too many, Emmett had confessed his intention to propose to Maeve. "Then do it right," Marcus had said, "not with ostentation or luxury, but with meaning. Give her something that reflects who she is, not who you are." The words had resonated. For weeks Emmett had observed Maeve, studying what truly made her happy, not expensive gifts or luxurious experiences, though she appreciated them with gratitude. What truly lit up her eyes were simple moments loaded with meaning, a particularly beautiful sunrise, discovering a rare species of wild orchid, helping an elderly neighbor with their garden, photographing light filtering through oak leaves. So instead of a ridiculously expensive ring in an elegant restaurant, Emmett created something completely different. That afternoon he had asked Maeve to wear her work clothes, old jeans, a simple t-shirt, comfortable sneakers. She had raised an eyebrow with curiosity but had complied. Then he guided her to the garden, but not to the main garden she knew so well. Instead, he led her through a path that had been closed for months, hidden behind a row of bamboo. "What?" Maeve began but stopped dead. Before her stretched a full acre that had been transformed into a community botanical garden. There were sections dedicated to traditional Appalachian medicinal plants, areas for organic crops, a greenhouse for protected species, and in the center an open space with rustic wooden benches for educational workshops. "It's yours," Emmett said softly. "Well, it's the community's technically. I've donated this part of the property to a trust that will manage the garden as an educational and conservation center. But you'll be the director if you accept. You'll have complete freedom to design programs, bring students, cultivate what you consider important." Maeve walked slowly through the paths, her fingers brushing plants she recognized from her childhood. Wild rosemary, mountain lavender, bloodroot, wild ginger. There were handwritten labels in each section, not with pompous scientific names, but with the common names mountain people used. "Emmett," her voice broke. It's perfect. It's more than I ever dreamed." "Wait," he said, taking her hand and guiding her to the center of the garden. There, under an ancient oak that must have been hundreds of years old, was a bronze plaque mounted on a natural stone. The inscription read, "Martha Calloway Community Botanical Garden, in honor of the grandmother who taught that true wealth grows from the earth and the heart." Tears began to roll down Maeve's cheeks. She touched the plaque with trembling fingers, reading her grandmother's name over and over. "But there's more," Emmett continued, his own voice trembling now. He knelt right there on the red Carolina clay, staining his expensive pants without caring at all. From his pocket he took out a small box, but instead of opening it immediately, he first took out an envelope. "Before I show you the ring, I want you to read this." With trembling hands, Maeve opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter from her grandmother. "My dear Maeve, Emmett asked my permission to marry you. Not just permission, but my blessing. He asked me what I expected from a man who would marry my granddaughter. I told him the truth, that he respect you, that he value you, that he never try to change your essence, but inspire you to grow. After spending time with him, I see he can be that man. Not because he's rich or successful, but because when he looks at you, I see the same love your grandfather had in his eyes when he looked at me, the kind of love that says, 'With you, I'm better. Give him my blessing. And tell that stubborn man he better make you happy, or he'll have to answer to a 90-year-old woman with nothing to lose. With all my love, your grandma.'" By the time Maeve finished reading, she was crying openly. Emmett, still kneeling, finally opened the small box. Inside wasn't a huge diamond or a platinum band full of precious stones. Instead, there was a simple silver ring, delicate but beautiful, with a small emerald set. And engraved on the inside, Maeve could see coordinates. "They're the exact coordinates of where we met," Emmett explained, "of the place in the garden where you were crying and where my life completely changed. Because that moment, Maeve, was when I began to wake up, when I began to understand that I was living but wasn't truly alive. He took a deep breath and continued, his voice loaded with emotion. I can't promise you a life without problems. I can't promise I'll always know what to do or that I'll never fail, but I can promise that every day I'll choose to love you. Every day I'll choose to grow with you instead of apart from you. Every day I'll choose to build a life that honors both of us, not just one of us. Maeve Calloway, would you do me the honor of being my wife? The silence that followed seemed eternal. The sun continued its descent, bathing everything in golden light. In the distance, the sound of birds returning to their nests could be heard, and then Maeve smiled, that smile that had always had the power to completely disarm Emmett. Yes, she said simply. 1,000 times, yes. When he slid the ring onto her finger, when they finally stood and embraced under the ancient oak, both felt something fundamental had changed. They hadn't just promised to marry, they had promised to build something new together, a bridge between their worlds that would be strong enough to support them both. That night, they celebrated with a simple dinner in the newly inaugurated garden. Bread Maeve had baked that morning, local cheese, pecans and wine from a small regional vineyard. There was no expensive champagne or elaborate menus, but there was genuine laughter, deep conversations, and a sense of completeness that no ostentatious party could have provided. You know what's the craziest thing? Maeve said later, when they were lying under the stars on a blanket, the ring catching glimmers of moonlight. A year ago, if someone had told me I'd be here engaged to a millionaire, I would have thought it was an impossible fantasy. But now that I'm here, it doesn't feel like fantasy. It feels like coming home. Emmett pulled her closer, kissing her forehead tenderly. That's because this is our home now. Not the estate, not the properties, not the things. Us. Wherever we are together, that's our home. Because true commitment isn't a promise of perfection, but the conscious decision to face together all the imperfections that life will inevitably bring. The night before the wedding, Maeve couldn't sleep. Not from nervousness about the ceremony. That was perfectly planned, and she felt completely secure in her decision to marry Emmett. It was something deeper, something she had been keeping inside for months, and that now, on the eve of their marriage, demanded to be released. They were in the house they had bought together near Asheville, a property much more modest than Emmett's previous ones, but infinitely more meaningful. It was an old farmhouse they had renovated together over the last months, mixing modern elements with traditional Blue Ridge architecture. It had views of the mountains and a garden Maeve was slowly transforming into her own personal paradise. At 2 in the morning, unable to stay in bed, she got up and walked barefoot to the terrace. The night was clear, the stars shone with that intensity only possible far from city lights. The air smelled of jasmine and the promise of summer. Can't sleep? Emmett's voice startled her. He had come out after her, wrapped in a robe, his hair disheveled from trying to sleep. I'm not supposed to see you before the wedding, she joked weakly. They say it's bad luck. To hell with superstition, he responded, approaching and wrapping his arms around her from behind. What's wrong? I can feel something's troubling you. Maeve remained silent for a long moment, gathering courage. Finally, she turned to look directly at him, needing to see his face when she said what she had to say. I need to confess something, and I need you to listen completely before reacting. Emmett frowned, worried, but nodded. When we met, Maeve began, her voice trembling slightly, I was in such a dark place. I'd just lost my job. I was worried about my grandmother. I felt completely lost. And then you appeared, like this impossible fantasy. Rich, handsome, interested in me. And I let myself get carried away by that. Maeve, I don't understand. Please, let me finish, she interrupted him. During the first months, there was a part of me that enjoyed your money. Not in a materialistic or calculating way, but being with you meant security I'd never known. It meant I could send more money to my grandmother, that I didn't have to worry about paying rent, that I could afford small luxuries. She moved away from him, unable to maintain eye contact. And I hated myself for that. I hated myself for enjoying the benefits of your wealth while simultaneously judging that same world. I felt like a hypocrite. Here I was, the humble gardener, preaching about values and simplicity while living in a luxury estate and wearing designer dresses. Tears began to roll down her cheeks, And the worst part is that for a long time, I wasn't sure if I loved you or if I loved the life you offered me. How could I know the difference? I'd never experienced either before. So when your empire began to collapse, when I thought you were going to lose everything, her voice broke completely. I felt relief. I felt terrible relief, because I'd finally know if what I felt was real. Emmett had become completely still, his expression indecipherable, the silence stretched, heavy and loaded. "And?" he finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What did you discover?" Maeve looked directly at him then, with tears flowing freely but her voice firm. "I discovered I love you more without the money than with it. I discovered the man who knelt in dirty earth with true humility is infinitely more attractive than the magnate who controlled empires. I discovered that every time you chose values over profits, humanity over success, I fell more deeply in love. And I discovered what I felt as relief wasn't about money at all. It was about finally seeing you being completely authentic, without the layers of protection wealth had given you." She took a step toward him. "But I needed to confess this, because tomorrow I'm going to marry you and I can't do it carrying this guilt. You needed to know there was a time when I wasn't sure, when I was confused, when the boundaries between loving you and loving what you could give me were blurred. And I need you to forgive me for that." The silence that followed was agonizing. Emmett walked toward the edge of the terrace, looking at the distant lights of Asheville, his back tense. Maeve felt her heart breaking, certain she had ruined everything with her honesty. Finally, he spoke without turning. "You want to know my confession?" Maeve blinked, surprised. "What?" He turned then, and there were tears in his own eyes. "At first, I saw you as a project, as something beautiful and pure I could possess and display. The humble gardener the magnate had rescued and transformed. I planned to turn you into my sophisticated wife, the woman on my arm at events, someone who would validate my success by showing how even common people wanted to be with me." The words were brutally honest, and they hurt even as Maeve understood he was speaking in the past tense. "I was so used to seeing people as acquisitions," Emmett continued, his voice broken, "as objects I could improve or control. And with you at first it was no different. I tripled your salary not out of generosity, but because I wanted you to feel obligated. I bought you clothes not to honor you, but to mold you. I took you to New York not to expand your horizons, but to dazzle you with my world." He approached her slowly. "And do you know when that changed? When you rejected me? When you set boundaries? When you challenged me again and again, refusing to be molded, insisting on being seen as an equal despite all our differences? That's when I began to truly love you. When you became someone I couldn't control, someone who forced me to be better simply by being yourself." He took her hands between his. "So if you carry guilt for enjoying the benefits of my wealth, I carry guilt for trying to buy you with it. If you doubted your feelings, I doubted my capacity to genuinely love someone without some ulterior motive. And if you need forgiveness, then I need forgiveness too." Maeve sobbed. But this time it was a sob of relief, of liberation. "We're a mess, aren't we?" she said with a tearful laugh. "We're human," Emmett corrected, wiping her tears with his thumbs. "Imperfect, complicated, sometimes selfish, sometimes confused, but actively choosing each other despite all that." They embraced there on the terrace under the stars, crying together for all the imperfections they had hidden, for all the fears they had carried in silence. And in that shared crying, in that brutal and vulnerable honesty, they found an intimacy deeper than any they had experienced before. "Tomorrow," Maeve finally said, her voice muffled against his chest, "tomorrow when we marry, it will be with full awareness of who we are. Not idealized versions or fantasies, but real human beings with mistakes and doubts and moments of selfishness, and we'll choose to love each other anyway." "Anyway," Emmett repeated, kissing the crown of her head. "And always." They stayed like that until dawn, sustained by each other, having crossed the last threshold of true intimacy, the willingness to be completely known, flaws included, and still be chosen. Because the deepest love isn't one based on imagined perfections, but one that flourishes despite and through all our imperfections, built on the solid foundation of radical honesty and unconditional acceptance. The wedding day dawned with a clear, deep blue sky that seemed like a divine blessing. In the small mountain community in Appalachia where Maeve had grown up, The entire community had mobilized to prepare the celebration. The dirt roads were decorated with garlands of white and yellow wildflowers. Neighbors had brought out their best tablecloths for the tables extending through the main square. The air was permeated with the aromas of dozens of traditional Appalachian dishes being prepared in family kitchens. Fried chicken, cornbread, green beans, apple pie, homemade preserves. Maeve prepared in her grandmother's house, surrounded by women from the community she had known all her life. Her dress was simple but beautiful, a lace design Emmett had commissioned from a local Asheville designer, incorporating traditional embroidery techniques that grandmothers in the region had used for generations. It wasn't ostentatious or expensive, but it was perfect. "You're beautiful, child," her grandmother said with tears in her eyes, adjusting the tulle veil that had belonged to her own mother. "Your grandfather would be so proud." In another part of the town, in a small house Emmett had rented for the occasion, he prepared with a nervousness no boardroom had ever provoked. Marcus and Claire were with him, and their mother, Eleanor, supervised everything with a critical but loving eye. "I never thought I'd see this day," Marcus admitted while helping his brother with his cufflinks. "The great Emmett Ashford, nervous about a wedding in a town most people can't find on a map." "This town," Emmett responded, looking out the window at the streets where children played and elderly people conversed in doorways, "has more real life than all the elegant ballrooms of Manhattan combined." Eleanor approached, taking her son's face between her wrinkled hands. "Your father would be proud," she said softly, "not of the empire you built, though that was impressive, but of the man you've become, the man who had the courage to let it all go to find what truly matters." The ceremony took place in the old community church, a white clapboard building that had witnessed weddings, baptisms, and funerals for more than 200 years. It was small, barely fitting the 100 people who made up the town plus Emmett's family and a few select friends. When Maeve appeared at the church entrance, walking arm in arm with her grandmother, who insisted on being the one to give her away, Emmett felt as if all the air left his lungs. It wasn't just her beauty, though she was absolutely stunning. It was something deeper. It was the absolute certainty that every step he had taken in his life, every decision, every mistake, had led him to this exact moment. The vows were a mixture of traditional and personal. The preacher, a 70-year-old man who had baptized Maeve as a baby, spoke about marriage not as the union of two perfect people, but as the daily decision of two imperfect people to grow together. When it came time for personal vows, Maeve spoke first, her voice clear and firm. "Emmett, I promise to love you in your best moments and your worst. I promise to be your partner, not your shadow or your reflection. I promise to challenge you when you're wrong and support you when you're right. I promise to remind you who you are when you forget, and I promise to grow with you toward who we can become. And I promise every day to choose you again, not out of obligation but out of genuine love." Then it was Emmett's turn, and when he spoke, there were tears without shame in his eyes. "Maeve, you came into my life like a gentle storm, without announcing yourself, without asking permission, simply being yourself with such authenticity that I had no choice but to change. You taught me that wealth has nothing to do with bank accounts and everything to do with human connections. You taught me to see beauty in simplicity, to find value in humility, to understand that success without purpose is just empty noise. I promise to honor all your dreams as much as mine. I promise never to try to change you, but only to support you as you become who you want to be. And I promise to build with you a life worth living, not just showing off." The exchange of rings was accompanied by tears from almost everyone present. Even Marcus, always so controlled, had to discreetly wipe his eyes. And when the preacher finally declared them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was loaded with a promise that went beyond words. This was real, this was forever, this was the beginning of something beautiful. The celebration that followed was everything a wedding in an Appalachian community should be. There was live music, banjo and fiddle that made people cry and laugh in equal measure. There was spontaneous dancing in the square, with elderly women teaching traditional steps to city visitors. There was food in abundance, served with love and shared generously. But the most significant moment came at sunset, when Emmett and Maeve briefly escaped the celebration to walk alone on a nearby mountain trail where she had played as a child. The sun was setting over the Blue Ridge Mountains, painting the sky in impossible shades of orange, pink and purple. The breeze rustled through the trees, and the air smelled of pine and infinite possibilities. "Any regrets?" Maeve asked, taking off her shoes and letting the cool earth caress her feet. "None," Emmett responded without hesitation. "Well, maybe one. Not meeting you sooner. Wasting so many years chasing things that didn't matter. But then, we wouldn't be who we are now," she reflected wisely. "You needed to live that life to appreciate this one. I needed to know loneliness to value companionship. Everything was necessary to bring us here." They walked in silence for a while, the sounds of celebration fading in the distance. Finally, Emmett stopped, looking at the horizon where the sun touched the mountains. "You know what's the most extraordinary thing about all this?" he said. "It's not just that we found each other. It's that we both had the courage to change, to be vulnerable, to admit we needed something different from what we thought we wanted. Most people spend their entire lives without that courage." Maeve rested her head on his shoulder, fitting perfectly against him, as if they'd been designed to complement each other. "My grandmother told me something this morning," she shared. "She said true love isn't finding someone perfect, but finding someone perfect for you. Someone whose imperfections fit with yours in a way that together you create something more complete than either could be alone." "Your grandmother is a very wise woman," Emmett smiled, kissing her hair. "She is," Maeve agreed. "She also said, if you get unbearable with age, I have her permission to lock you out of the garden until you remember your manners." Emmett's laugh echoed over the sound of the evening breeze, genuine and free in the way only she could provoke. They stayed like that while the sun completed its descent, knowing they'd soon have to return to the celebration, but savoring this private moment where it was just the two of them and the vast mountains. When they finally returned to the square, darkness had fallen, and hundreds of candles and lanterns created a magical atmosphere. The music continued, now slower, more intimate. Couples of all ages danced, and when Emmett extended his hand to Maeve, she took it without hesitation. They danced under the stars, surrounded by a community that had welcomed them, by a family that had blessed them, by a future they had chosen to build together. And in that moment, both understood a fundamental truth. They had found not just love, but home. Not a place, but a feeling of absolute belonging that came from being completely known and completely accepted. The party continued into the early morning hours. There were emotional speeches and cheerful toasts. There were tears of joy and laughter, of pure happiness. There were moments of solemnity and moments of complete irreverence. It was perfectly imperfect, exactly as it should be. Years later, when people asked about their wedding, Emmett and Maeve always smiled with the same knowing smile, because no description could truly capture what that day had meant. Not just the union of two people, but the fusion of two worlds, the validation that true love transcends all barriers society constructs, and the promise that with courage, honesty, and unwavering commitment, it's possible to build something beautiful even from the most unlikely beginnings. In their home near Asheville, which over the years would fill with photographs and memories, with plants Maeve would cultivate, and projects Emmett would launch, with visits from family and friends, with laughter and occasional tears, with all the ordinary but extraordinary elements that compose a well-lived life. In that home they built together, there would always exist a simple but powerful reminder of that day on the mountain. A framed photograph of two silhouettes against an Appalachian sunset, taken by a friend in that stolen moment. No poses, no artifice, just two people looking toward the same horizon, choosing to face the future together. And below the photograph, a plaque engraved with words that summarized everything they had learned, everything they had built, everything they would continue to be. True love is not finding each other perfect, but choosing each other imperfect, and in that daily choice, building something infinitely more beautiful than perfection could ever be.